In this lecture, I'm going to describe the anatomy of the nervous system. So before we talk about the anatomy of the nervous system, we need to know the function of the nervous system. One of the most important functions is initiate and regulate the movement of the body part. The second thing, they regulate the secretion from the gland, from our sweaty gland, from our endocrine gland. The other thing, they gather information about the external environment and the internal environment of the body, and usually they do this by using the senses, which is the sight, hearing, touch, balance, and taste, and also mechanism to detect the pain, the temperature, pressure, and certain chemicals inside the blood, such as the carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and oxygen. And this is very important to maintain an appropriate state of consciousness. Also, they stimulate the thirst, hunger, fear, rage, and sexual behavior appropriate for survival. So the nervous system can be divided into two parts. We have the central nervous system and we have the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, which includes the brain, and the brain has the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Also, we have the spinal cord, which is found in the spinal cavity. And the other structure we have the peripheral nervous system, and we have two types of peripheral nervous system. We have the cranial nerve and we have the spinal nerve. So the nerves that emerge from the base of the brain and mostly supply structures within the head, that's the cranial nerve. Whereas the other nerves that we can see here, all of these nerves are the spinal nerves. So again, this is the area of the brain, which is include cerebellum, and the brainstem, and then we have the spinal cord. All of these structures are the central nervous system, whereas the nerve that emerge from the spinal cord and emerge from the base of the brain are the peripheral nervous system. As I said, we have two types. We have the cranial nerve, also we have the spinal nerves. The peripheral nerves could be sensory or could be motor. The sensory, which is the afferent, and usually gather information about external and internal environment and relay these information toward the brain. And usually we have specialized organ that can detect the stimuli, and they called the sensory receptors. In the brain, there is interpret of this information and integrate this information and initiate appropriate, could be movement of the body or glandular secretion or behavior response. And this information that going to send from the brain to the organs will be through the motor efferent nerve, which is the communication between the central nervous system and the muscle, and usually this accomplished by the peripheral nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, which controls the activity of the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands, which are considered as the involuntary, and usually these are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And this autonomic nervous system has both components in the central nervous system and also in the peripheral nervous system. To understand the anatomy of the nervous system, we need to understand the histology or the microscopic neuroanatomy. Usually, our brains consist of gray matter and the white matter. And the gray matter, which is the collection of the neuronal cell body, and the white matter is the collection of the neuronal processes, which include the axons and the dendrites. So the basic functional unit of the nervous system is the neuron. And these neurons consist of neuronal cell body, and we have this processes and this process. This one here is called the dendrites, and usually these carries the information toward the cell body, whereas the one that carries the information away from the cell body is called the axons. Collection of the neuronal cell body inside the central nervous system forms structure, we call it the gray matter, whereas the collection of the neuronal processes, which include the dendrites and the axons, are responsible for the formation of the white matter. So we can see here, this is the cell body, and each neuron has only one axons, but it could have multiple dendrites or one dendrites, or sometimes there is no dendrites. So these all the cytoplasmic extension from the cell body. All of these structures are the dendrites, whereas this one here, which is the axon, and this one here we have the cell body. Synapse, any contact between two neurons like this here, we call it the synapse, and we have one element here and we have the second element, which is number 1 and number 2. This is the preganglionic portion, and this is the postganglionic portion. And at this area here we have the synapse, and the synapse could be between the axon and the cell body, or the axon with the axon, or axon with dendrites. Usually the neurons classified depend on their morphology. If they have one process, one dendrites, and one axons, we call them the bipolar. If they have one axon, multiple dendrites, then we call them the multipolar. If there's no dendrite, then we call it the unipolar. And if the axons fuse with the dendrite before they end the cell body, we call it the pseudo-unipolar. And this one only found in the dorsal root ganglion, the spinal cord, whereas this one only found during the embryonic period. As I said, the nervous system consists of the neuron, and as I said, the collection neuronal cell body is called the gray matter, and the collection of the neuronal processes called the white matter. Usually in the central nervous system, not only we see the neuronal cell body, we can see other cells, like all of these cells we see here. These cells is called neuroglia, and these cells are the supporting cell of the nervous system. In the nervous system, as a supportive tissue, we have cells rather than we have a connective tissue. Most of the tissues we studied before and organ before usually supported by fibrous connective tissue. In the brain, we don't have these supportive connective tissue. Instead, we have cells, and these cells is called neuroglia. And these neuroglia cells, we have different cell type of these glial cells. We have the astrocyte, we have microglia, we have the oligodendrocyte, and we have the microglia and the ependymal cells. We have 4 cells that found in the central nervous system, and only we have 1 cell that found in the peripheral nervous system, which is the Schwann cell, and which is responsible for the formation of the myelin sheath. As I said, this is the area of the spinal cord, and this is the area where we have the neuronal processes, and this is area is called the gray matter, and almost the shape as the butterfly. Whereas the area outside here is the area where we have the neuronal processes, and this area here, all of it is called the white matter, whereas the one we can see here, this is the gray matter. Now we'll talk a little bit about the development of the nervous system, because it's very important to understand the spaces that found and the areas that develop the central nervous system. So shortly after gastrulation is the stage where early in the development we have one layer that form the fetus. This one is going to form 3 layers, and the process that change the embryo from 1 layer into 3 layers is called the gastrulation. In this process we'll have ectoderm, we have mesoderm, and we have endoderm. We can see here at the area of the future brain, almost at the area in the mid region, there is differentiation of these ectodermal cells into neuroectodermal cells, and these cells will proliferate faster in the periphery than in the midline. At the end, we can see this is the groove that form, which is the neural groove. The ends of these grooves are growing toward each other. At the end, they form this tube, which is called the neural tube, and the ectoderm from this area will continue to grow, and this area here will future where we have the skin. Very important, this structure is formed, which is the neural tube. This neural tube will undergo proliferation, differentiation, and migration. Proliferation, which is increase in the cell number. Differentiation is that transform the cell to more complex cells. And once these cells differentiation, they could not regress back. And finally, the cells that proliferate in this area here, for example, they migrate outward. So this is how the neural groove formed on the neural fold, and finally where we have the neural tube, and you can see there is a lumen inside, which is the neural canal, and this neural canal persists. It will be still exist in the adult tissue. As I said, these epithelium start to proliferate and differentiate, and there's a migration. And we can see here we have 3 layers, 1, 2, 3. And in this layer here, the inner zone, the middle, and the outer. The one that found here, because it's near the lumen, this is the ventricular zone. Then we have the middle, which is the intermediate or mantle, and finally we have the superficial. And we can see here at this area here in the spinal cord, this is the area where the neuronal cell body will be collected, and they send their processes outside, and this will result in the formation of the white matter and the formation of the gray matter. Usually the one that found in the dorsal portion is called alar, where the one that found in the base called the basal plate. The alar plate will result in the formation of the dorsal horn, which concerned with the sensory function, whereas the basal plate will be formed the ventral horn, which is mostly control the motor function. The inner zone here will form a thin layer here, which called the ependymal cells, and we can see here this canal here, which is the remnant of the neural tube, will persist as the central canal of the spinal cord. Again, the intermediate, as I said, the mental layer, and this layer will has the neuron and the neuroglial cells, which is the supportive cells, and this will result in the formation of the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. And the marginal, mostly which consist of nerve processes, okay, which is the one that outside here, and these are called the one here between the dorsal horn and the dorsal border of the spinal cord, the funiculus or cord, and this one here, the lateral funiculus, and finally here, this is the area of the ventral funiculus. The development of the brain little bit is different. We saw before that the spinal cord is formed from a tube, whereas the area of the brain is developed instead of a tube. We have the three physical stage: 1, 2, and 3. Number 1 is called prosencephalon. The second one, which is the mesencephalon, and the last one is the rhomboencephalon. The prosencephalon will develop the area of the forebrain, the first part of the cranial portion of the brain, and the mesencephalon will develop the mid portion of the brain, and finally the rhomboencephalon will result in the formation of the hindbrain. Then these three physical stage, okay, this is the three physical stage, will change and go to the next stage, which is the 5 physical stage. At this stage, the prosencephalon is going to divide into 2 physicals, and the rhomboencephalon also again going to divide into 2 physical. The first one, which is the prosencephalon, going to be divided into the telencephalon, and this will be our future cerebrum, whereas the next portion from the prosencephalon will form the diencephalon, which is the area of the thalamus, epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. And this one here, which is the area of rhomboencephalon, is going to be divided into metencephalon and myelencephalon. The metencephalon will result in the formation of the bones and cerebellum, whereas the myelencephalon will result in the formation of the future medulla oblongata. And you can see here that the mesencephalon will not divide, will be kept as one physical, which is the mesencephalon, and this one here will give us the future midbrain. So we can here see that this is the area of the spinal cord, and this is the area where we have the 3 physical stage: prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhomboencephalon. Then we have the 5 physical stage. We can see here, this is the area of the telencephalon, which is our future cerebrum. This is the area of the diencephalon, which is the future area of the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and retina. We can see here that here will be kept as one physical, which is the mesencephalon, which our future midbrain. And we can see here is divided into 1 and 2. Metencephalon will give us the bones and cerebellum, whereas the myelencephalon will give us the medulla oblongata. We can see here these cavities persist in the adults. In the spinal cord, we call them the central canal, whereas in the brain we call them the ventricles, and we are going to discuss that later.